1,000 years ago. And this cathedral is a 12th century cathedral that was built there, and it is now the Lutheran Cathedral since the Reformation. The Reformation was really early in Latvia, especially in Riga. They became Lutheran as early as 1522. So Luther was still writing and starting, well, not intentionally, but it was starting. Luther was still just getting started, and they became followers of his teachings very early. So there's a long history of Lutheranism in that area. So I was in St. Petersburg, and I was serving with the church, the Lutheran church there. This area of St. Petersburg is interesting. That's the church called the Church Our Savior on
Church of the Savior on Spilt Blood.
Church of the Savior on Spilt Blood is how it is, and it's actually a shrine dedicated to Alexander II, the Tsar. He was assassinated by revolutionaries in the 19th century. But what's interesting is in this area, they was referred to as the foreign area, and there are 3 Lutheran churches within walking distance of that. St. Catherine's, which is the Swedish Lutheran Church, St. Mary's, the Finnish Lutheran Church, and St. Peter's, which was the German Lutheran Church. When St. Petersburg was founded, this area had already been under the control of the Swedes. It was part of the Swedish Empire. I'll go to the next one. Oh, that's the church. And they had encouraged Finnish citizens to move to this area and settle there. So the Lutheran Church has been present in this area of now Russia since the 1600. And when Peter decided to create his Peter the Great to create his northern capital so he could have a navy, he took this area over, and at least 60% of the population by the time he built St. Petersburg was Lutheran. Lutheranism prior to the Russian Revolution made up a good portion. It was the second largest Protestant Christian denomination in Russia. And 60%, like I said, of St. Petersburg was Lutheran. So Lutherans have a very long history in Russia. Names that you hear in Russian history actually have Lutheran roots. The architect of the Winter Palace, which is the Hermitage, was Lutheran. Worked for Catherine the Great when they built it. The Fabergé egg jewelers and that were members of St. Anne's Lutheran Church in the city and were instrumental in establishing many of the Lutheran parochial schools in the area. So Lutherans have a long history there in the country. I worked specifically with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Ingria in Russia. Just to give you a background, this is one of the Lutheran churches in Karelia, which is a border region with Finland. And this is a Good Friday service at one of the nursing homes that they sponsor. They have 6 nursing homes in the St. Petersburg area for indigent seniors. Can't afford care and so forth. And so they actually run 6 homes for them in the region. So this red area is what was the old Ingria area, and they're ethnic Finns. There's this kind of Finnish connection. Estonians are ethnic Finns. Ingrians are ethnic Finns. You'll hear the term Karelia. Karelians are ethnic Finns. And there's actually a group called the Volks. And they live in that region between Estonia and Ingria, and they're called the Volks. And they've been there for centuries. And so St. Petersburg is actually can be called the Isthmus, the Karelian Isthmus. This is Lake Ladoga. This is the Finnish Gulf of Finland there. And like I said, Lutherans have been in this Ingria region since the 16th century. But the revolution comes, and their churches were closed. Many were just burned by the communists. Many were turned into municipal buildings. St. Anne's, which is the oldest Lutheran church in St. Petersburg was turned into a movie theater, called Spartak movie theater. Another one was turned into, there's an island of Kronstadt that sits in the Gulf of Finland, and there's a Lutheran church on that island, and they had turned it into a water processing treatment plant. And when you walk in, they're still working with the government trying to get it taken care of, and they literally, you walk into the church and there's a water processing equipment right in the sanctuary. So the Ingrians in particular, because of the Finnish link to that ethnic group, Stalin didn't trust them. He thought they would side with the Finns in a war. So he had them deported, he had them executed, and 80,000 in particular in 1930s were executed just because of their Finnish ancestry. Many others were deported. At least 50% of the population found themselves in Siberia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and because of that, there are now Lutheran churches in those regions, and the Ingrians call those churches the Pearls of the East now. But they went through quite a bit. They lost all their property, all the schools they had were gone, and so they went into hiding, worshipped in hiding. This picture actually is, they've kept it as a memorial. It's hard to tell, but that's actually in the middle of a cemetery in a village called Kolbino, which is just outside of St. Petersburg. It was originally a Finnish village. It gets renamed. The Finnish name is Kelto. I have to tell you the story. When I first, I would have to take the metro as far east as I could in the city. And then I get up and I would get on these bus, what they call marshrutka. And it's a taxi bus is the best way to describe it. You go in and you pay a fee for the distance you're going to go. And the bus only stops if you ask it to stop or if you're waiting for it. And it's a small van-like bus. It maybe has 20 seats and it has a standing area. Many times I've been on the marshrutka and easily there were 40 people on a 20-seat bus. And to get it to stop, you have to ask the driver to stop, or if you're waiting for the bus and you see the bus number, you have to wave to them to get them to stop. If you don't, they'll just drive on by. And that's marshrutka. Or you can ride the bus, and when you ride the bus, you have this. Where my story is, you have to go to a conductor and you have to tell him the stop you're going to go to. And I was just on this bus, and it was the first time I had ever. I was on with the conductor, and the village stop was Kolbino. But I didn't know the accurate pronunciation, so I used to say Kolbino, kind of put an Italian accent on it. So I go up to the conductor, and I go, Kolbino. She looks at me, and the Russian word for what is stop. She goes, stop, Kolbino. Stares at me again, stop. And this went on about 3-4 times. And then finally she pauses after I, and she stares at me. Well, she finally figures out what I'm saying. She rolls her eyes, and Russians were always good for rolling their eyes. And she rolls her eyes, and then she stares at me, and she goes, Kolbino. And so yes, I learned the correct pronunciation. So, Kolbino. So I pay my fee, I get the ticket, and I get to the school, and I worked with a translator, and the translator was very, very heavily involved with the Finnish Kelto kind of culture, the community. And I told her my experience on the bus, and she looked at me and she goes, you should have just gave the real name, Kelto, which was the old Finnish name. And as I learned later, I didn't want to go down that route, but I learned later that it's actually kind of a nationalistic thing, and the Finns will push on the Russians and just go back to using the old Finnish names. So anyhow, this is in the village of Kolbino, and it is a Lutheran cemetery. And it's hard to tell, but if you look closer, there's actually crosses, the metal crosses and that, and they have fences all around it. There had been a church there that had been burned, and they would meet in this clearing during the Soviet period, and they would hold worship. A lot of times, the men had been deported for labor, so it would just be women gathering, and they would do just a prayer service and meet in this area, but they preserved it because memory is a very important part of their life today. What was funny is when the restrictions for COVID came, and they closed, the churches were closed for 6 weeks, but they didn't stop meeting as a group because meeting is very important because they know what it's like not to have a church community, and they went back and they were worshiping there to avoid the rules. But they were eventually allowed in the 1950s to return back to this region, and in the 1970s they were allowed to organize 2 churches. And eventually, when they collapsed, they were able to reorganize the church. But they stayed connected. A lot of house activities, a lot of infant baptisms and sinks. It was a fascinating phrase I remember hearing from a girl who came for confirmation classes. She was in her early 20s, and she said, I know we were Lutheran in my grandparents had been Lutheran, so I know I have this heritage. And she was trying to look into this heritage. And I remember asking her, are you baptized? And her response was, I don't know. My grandmother died. And that was what happened. Grandmothers would baptize their children in the sink. So part of my calling was to go and teach and help pastors learn basic theological skills to be Lutheran pastors. We have a luxury in the States because as a pastor, if I have any issues, I can call up a retired pastor. I could go to a meeting with other pastors with much more years experience than I do, who could say, hey, yeah, we had a similar problem like that. We did this. Or have you considered that? They don't have that luxury. They don't have that luxury because the church has only been restored with, as you would understand, a church with pastors and bishops that they have for 30 years, since the 90s. So, and the last theologically trained pastor for them through a proper seminary training was executed in 1937. So there's no corporate knowledge, and that was part of what I was doing. I would go out and do seminars with pastors, and just talk about basic things of how did our church organize, how did we do Bible studies, how did I do hospital visits and stuff like that. Not to say they don't know how to do it, but sometimes it was a matter of getting them to think about things and that. This is a seminary that was built in Covenant with the assistance of the LCMS. It actually has dormitories and classrooms and a chapel in the village. This is one of my classes. It's not just pastors that are being trained, but a lot of times it is deaconesses and church musicians. They're coming from all parts of Russia. The 2 gentlemen of the Demas, as we would call them, they both had the same name, Dima, and they came. This Dima came from Karelia. This Dima came from the Volga Valley. This gentleman with the long hair, we used to give him a bad time because he had long hair and a beard, and we said, "Oh, Jesus complex, I guess." But he actually came from the Far East. He came from Irkutsk, which is over by Lake Baikal, and then she is a church musician / deaconess training, and she came from just south of St. Petersburg. And that's the class. And the person taking the picture is actually my translator. So, and I would work with the translator, and I would give the lecture. I'd speak so much in English, and she would translate for me. And then I learned a little bit of Russian, not enough to give a lecture of. I would go out in seminars. This is actually one of the seminars in Yoshkar Ola. It's in the Volga Valley in the what's called the Mariel Republic, and it was a church conference, a regional church conference. So there was laity there, and I can't remember what the topic was, spot I was speaking to the group, and that's actually the sanctuary. It's a small sanctuary in Yashka. And then we had an English service at St. Anne's, and I'm actually in the chapel filling in for the pastor who served there. And it was funny, where the chapel is in this church, because it had been a movie. Oh, I'm sorry, I get the sign. I'm going to. Because it had been a theater during the Soviet period, the chapel had actually been a bar, and there's actually pictures of a long bar on the backside, a lounge type bar, and so forth. And then I also would help out with the Lawson service. This was I think I was doing the readings during this. This particular church had been burned. It had been handed back, and shortly after being handed back, it had burned mysteriously. And the government, because the building was it was the oldest building in St. Peter's Church, Lutheran Church in St. Petersburg, the local government was responsible to restore the outside, because St. Petersburg is a UNESCO heritage site. But they haven't really had the money to build the inside, to restore the inside. But what they've done, this was a local artist who came and did religious art for them. The inside, because it's burned out and kind of it just has this kind of image, they use it for art displays when they're not doing worship. And we do a lot of art displays that tell sections of the story of the Bible, like the 7 days of creation, or the story of Noah's Ark, or Easter, Lenten. They did a whole presentation on the tabernacle in the wilderness, and they actually brought in and poured sand over the whole floor of the church, and then set up a tent tabernacle, and people would come in, and I think at one time, one presentation we did like that, they had 30,000 people come in to see this, because it was in a month, because it had become this place to see in St. Petersburg, and they use it to promote Christ. This is an installation, an ordination of a new pastor. The gentleman in the middle is the Bishop Ivan Loktev of the Ingrian Church. This is the pastor, Yevgeny is the pastor there at the church. We also helped out with some of their outreach locally. This is an English club. We'd have 40 people come every Tuesday to practice their English. Russians start learning English since the first grade, and they all through their public schooling they study English as a main course. And a lot of times, because it's just book work, they don't necessarily get practice. And I had that rare, and my wife also helped out. We had that rare and unique skill. We were native speakers of English, so people would come in, and we'd have discussions on topics, or we would deal with. We would do films, English films, and we talk about the films, or we do game night, and we would play games that involved English skills. And like I said, we'd have anywhere from 35 to 40 people show up for these events. And then we would also do English camps, and it's like a VBS. Think about doing VBS in immersion in a language. So this summer you do a VBS, but you do it all in Haitian. But we did it in English for them. We would go 3 to 4 days. We spent a month going through several churches and doing this camp system. And right here in this one is they're working on they were doing skits. They had to learn to do skits in English and then perform it for their parents on the last day. These are both my daughters here, and their group at one of the camps. They were teaching them an American game, so they taught them Duck Duck Goose. So they were playing, and at another, this is one of the, I think it was a presentation of the group. This one, we were teaching them baseball skills. And we were in, this one we were in the town of Nizhny Novgorod, but we were in the city of Kazan, which is in the Volga Valley, in the Republic of Tartarstan, which is actually, it's a Muslim republic in Russia. and so the largest population are Muslims. And we had Tartar kids coming for the camp to practice English and that. And we did a pickle type baseball pickle game. We had 4 bases. We had the kids run between the bases so they didn't get tagged out. And this 7-year-old Tartar boy, he thought it was the best game in the world. And he would run on the base. He'd stand there, and when he saw it was free, he'd turn and he'd go, "Paka!" And he'd run up. And "paka" in Russian is slang for bye. Bye. So he'd run up and go, "Paka!" and then take off running between the bases. And then they did a skill challenge after each one where they would get directions, and they would have to figure out the directions and the skill, and then they would get the next clue. And it was a pirate treasure thing. And this is one of the Russian pastors, Konstantin Subbotin is his name, and he was pretty much leading that portion in that, and so he was the pirate for the things. What's funny is our entire time there, we never had an issue with the FSB, which is the Internal Security. It was the successor to the KGB, and it's much more expansive than just spy, and that's an aspect, but they do internal security. And we were at a place, and there had been a burglary, and the police were investigating burglary next door, and to the church, and they heard English speakers at the church, so they reported foreigners were at FSB, and they came to check out who we were to make sure we weren't breaking the law. And we were fine, our visas were in order and so forth, but he is actually a licensed translator that he could work in courts as an English translator if need be. So he's there dressed like this, talking to the FSB officers, saying, no, we're okay, there's nothing to worry about. If you need me, I can go, I'm certified and all that, but he's dressed like this pirate, talking to them. This is the church, St. Anne's, that I mentioned. This is the outside that the government restored. This is actually the oldest Lutheran church in St. Petersburg, and this is the interior, what it looks like then. It's just not fully restored. And it's now become something of itself. I don't know if they'll ever restore it now.
If it's safe, then they really...
Yeah, safe. They've restructured wherever there's been weaknesses it's a brick construction primarily. They've reinforced the banisters or stairwells and so forth. Most of the stairwells actually have like concrete type pour that. This is the church in Kazan, and they reach out to the Tartar people. There are actually a lot of former Muslims that are associated with this church. But because of that cultural link in that, the interior of the church reflects the Tartar culture in kind of a fine thing. That's at St. Andrews in St. Andrews Lutheran Church. This is the church in Moscow. It's Most Holy Trinity. Oh, I got that. I'm going too far over. Most Holy Trinity, and it is in a Lutheran cemetery. Keep in mind there were millions of Lutherans, and there are Lutheran cemeteries in a lot of the larger cities. And this is the old chapel that they did funerals in the cemetery, but when they got it from the government, they restored it as a parish congregation in there. And so this is Most Holy Trinity in Moscow. And then this is the church in Krasnoyarsk, which is in the Far East. It's one of, I can't remember how far east, but it's just above Mongolia, kind of the eastern edge of Mongolia. That's how far east it goes. Yeah. Well, when we were there, it was cold. Yes, we was there. It was in end of January, February. We had gone, and so at that time it was cold. There was a community. This is one of those. A lot of the people who attend this church were descendants of people who had been deported from the St. Petersburg area, and they stayed. A lot of the cities in Siberia grew during the war because they became factory cities, and they sat along the rail line, and this was one of them. So this community, finally, they didn't have the money to build. So what they bought was an old machine shop and turned it into their church, and it sits in the middle of a kind of a industrial area. The old Soviet cement buildings line it. Apartment blocks are around it, and then there was an industrial working area in the middle of it, and that's where their church sits. And they worship in that.
Good use of the
Pardon? It was good use, yeah. But so they that's how they use it. It's yellow though because that's the Ingrian national flag. There's an Ingrian flag that's yellow and blue looks just like the Swedish flag, but yellow and blue. Remembrance is a very big part of that. There's a cemetery, the Shovo Memorial Cemetery in the north side. It's in the forest of St. Petersburg. And during the Soviet period, it was off limits. And when the Soviet system collapsed, and they had gone to the records, the KGB records were opened up. They discovered that this forest had been the dumping ground for disappeared people. And they estimate about 20,000 people are buried in this graveyard that had been literally arrested or disappeared off the streets of St. Petersburg. They would be interrogated in a building somewhere in the city and then taken to the basement and executed. And then they would come at night with a truck and they would throw the bodies in the trunk and they get dumped in this place. So October 31st in Russia, it is a national holiday. It's the holiday for the remembrance of government oppression. And so they go out, the Ingrians, because they have one of the largest groups in the cemetery. They go out and they do a memorial that day. They do a worship service. And so this is the bishop and one of the pastors leading the worship service in the cemetery. And all through there are markers for the different groups that were arrested and disappeared. And then these are the people. I don't know if you can see it if you're close enough there, but look at the faces and tell me what you notice.
It's right there.
Well, it is right. But their faces. Look at the faces. You're kind of distant. It's kind of small. They're young. The average age for a lot of the churches in St. Petersburg, especially St. Anne's, is under 30. And their mission work is not fancy lights and fancy music. They just simply do what they do. They offer courses like the English Club, or the art. St. Anne's will do art, but a lot of the churches will offer these introduction to Christianity courses, which are pretty much Luther's Small Catechism, and they do it for 9 weeks, and people will come to it. And they will take the course, and they'll get attracted with community, and people will come and eventually join the church. One of my students had been an atheist, and he took one of these courses as he's told me, to learn what he didn't believe. And he took the course, and when it was finished, he was baptized. And then after being a part of the church community for a couple of years, he decided to go to seminary to be a pastor. And that's where I met him. So it was never, like I said, it's never flashy. They just do what they do out of the hymnal. They do offer courses. It's not, for them, it's not importance of, how do I make myself look attractive? They just do who they are. And that's how a lot of their growth has been. Yes, sir?
I've got a couple of questions. I talk a lot. I like your cross. It's different.
This is, actually the Ingrian cross.
I've been raised Russian Orthodox. On my mother's side, I was raised Lutheran. I used to walk a mile to church, and my grandmother would make us go, and we'd be sitting and the ushers would just shake us when we were young. My point is, what about the Russian Orthodox? That church is gone in Russia?
No, it's there. It's there. But
are they strong? Are they pretty strong?
They're politically, yes, they're pretty strong, and there's still a lot of Russians that go. They're still the largest Christian church.
Okay.
But younger generations are frustrated with Orthodoxy because of its links to the government. But Baptists are too strange. So they are attracted to Lutheranism because it's liturgical, but it's not, and there's not a whole lot. It's not tied to the devil. So that's part of the reason why you see a lot of growth in some areas.
Their crosses had three of them, a Russian cross.
Yeah, Russian cross.
Another Jew cross is different.
Yeah, this is a T-shirt that the Ingrians sold. It has an I, Ingria, and a K, Kelto, which means the Finnish type. Ingria Kelto is kind of what this is. Kirka, Ingria Kirka. If the K is Kirka, Kirch. They use a similar word.
How
so that's,
cold does it get there?
Pardon?
How cold does it get?
We were in Omsk, and it was a sunny day, and it was minus 44.
Oh, wow.
So, okay. Russia is full. There are 200 different types of ethnic groups and languages in Russia, and there are also a multitude of religions. One of them is there are quite a few Buddhists in Russia, and this is actually pictures from the Buddhist temple or the Datsun in St. Petersburg. They follow a form of Tibetan Buddhism, and there are actually 2 Buddhist republics in the country. Republics, you got to think of them as like a state, semi-autonomous. They've been around since the czars, the kind of that concept, and some of them have religious connotations. So they're the basis. So there are at least two Buddhist republics. Islam is very large. There's a lot of Islam in the eastern part of European Russia and into the Caucasus region. There are Muslims through there. This is the main mosque in Kazan, which is in Tatarstan, which is a Muslim republic. This is the mosque in St. Petersburg. We actually lived a mile and a half. We go by that every Sunday when we rode the bus to church. We go by that mosque and a number of other churches. So there's a multitude. Orthodoxy is the main religion in Russia. Its presence is very, very well known. Catholicism is very small. It is not. There are more Lutherans, or actually, there's probably more Baptists than there are Catholics in Russia. So this is the main church. What was it again, Alexander?
Christ the Savior.
Christ the Savior. This is the one they actually rebuilt. It was torn down in 1929 by the communists. If you ever see the old black and white pictures from them tearing churches and dropping bells and blowing up towers, that was the church, and they rebuilt it in like 5 years. And then this is the Church of Split Blood in St. Petersburg. And this is a pagan. This is a pagan cemetery. A form of paganism has been still practiced to this day for at least 1,500 years. They know of recorded history in that region. So this is a cemetery. There's a water. There's actually a river in the distance. There's sacred groves that they need, and these are pagan grave sites. And this is very typical of Russia. They always have a fence around the plot. Russians love fences, and everything has a fence, including your grave. But they plant a tree. Usually there's a tree on the top. It has ribbons. The idea is that they can pull themselves out. They have everything they need for the afterlife: buckets to go get water, dishes to eat from. There's a whole tradition that when someone dies, the family needs to do certain things. At one point, they need to go drink with their relative at the gravesite, and so this was in towards the Ural Mountains. At this point, I think we were about 100 kilometers from being in Asia. So we were in, I think, another 150. We would have been in Kazakhstan. So. And this is, and there are two pagan republics. The Mariel Republic is pagan, and that's Muslim. But there's a large Bashkiria, which is the Bashkiria Republic has a very large pagan population. Some of the pastors that I've dealt with in the Volga, who are you'll hear names like Mariel, Moshka, Etsi, They are coming from these Finno-Ugric people, who are the precursors to the Finns and the Hungarians. Their language precursors both those groups. And a lot of the people, it's like their families are divided because of the Lutherans work in those regions. They are Lutheran, or they're pagan if they practice anything. So one of the pastors had actually been raised, I got to know, he had actually been raised pagan, as a pagan. And he talked about going out for the festivals and sacrificing, usually poultry, ducks, or in the sacred groves. That was the big surprise for me that still went on in those regions. Because of geopolitical situation, we had to leave Russia. Not because of the Russians per se. It was because of finances. When they canceled SWIFT and they canceled all the flights to Europe, and that there was a fear by the LCMS that we would get stranded, and that now the Russians kept saying, "Well, why do you have to leave?" Well, I'm a man under authority. I have to follow the directions. So we ended up leaving, and they moved us to Riga, Latvia. And there's, as I mentioned, there's a very old Lutheran community there in Riga, and their history is very similar to the Ingres. When they came under Soviet control after World War II, a third of their population was deported. Literally, rail cars were brought into Latvia, and they loaded up the native Latvians, and they disappeared into Siberia. And they talk about that. They talk about their churches being closed. Everything I told you what the Ingrians went through, the Latvians did. Every church in Russia or the old Soviet Union, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia are predominantly Lutheran. Lithuania, which had been under Polish control, is predominantly Catholic. And they all went through the same story. And they're rebuilding their congregations. But in Latvia, there was an arrangement with the LCMS to establish a program called the Luther Academy to train pastors around the world using the internet and seminars in regions to serve in areas where there are not necessarily access to a seminary because the number is not large enough to support their own seminary, or they live in a place where they cannot open a seminary. And so there are students then, primarily in Europe. There's students there's a few students in Italy. There are students in Bulgaria and Romania, helping to reestablish Lutheran churches in those areas. They're taking that, but there are also students from Turkey, because the laws in Turkey, you cannot own, if you didn't own it before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, you cannot open a new Christian church. So they share their property. And they cannot open a seminary. So this allows, there is a Lutheran Church of Turkey. They have churches in Istanbul and in Izmir, or Ephesus, and there are actually Turkish Lutheran churches in Bulgaria. There's a large Turkish population in Bulgaria. So there are Lutheran communities in Pakistan, and they have very similar rules. And there's actually a student who is in Nepal who had been watching Lutheran pastors on YouTube and decided that he wanted to be Lutheran. And he found this. So this is the program. And there are also students in South Sudan and Malawi. And this is actually a typical class picture, kind of. I spent time, I had already been working with them when I was teaching with the Russians. So I'd already started lecturing online for them. And this is kind of what your classroom looks like, kind of Zoom calls. If you've been in business for the last year, Zoom calls and Skype calls. And I would lecture in the evenings, and I'd have students in time zones from Pakistan to Western Europe, primarily. And this is from a seminar that they held in Latvia, just few in April. I was able to, and you tell there are students from Pakistan there. There's students from Italy. One of the students from Italy is actually Brazilian, and he had immigrated to Italy, and now is studying to be a Lutheran pastor. There's Pat from Romania. This is some of the instructors. This is Dr. Just from Fort Wayne, Indiana. He had actually been leading the seminar. This is my co-worker, Corey Rajek. He's the pastor, for the LCMS pastor I work with. And this is Hayden. What's Hayden? And she is a missionary in the Czech Republic for the LCMS, and she teaches English, and she's helping to tutor students because the program is done in English, and so she tutors students to perfect their English for classes. And this is Davis Wowa, Pastor Davis Wowa, who serves in a church in Malawi, and he has been taken. He's becoming Lutheran in that. When we finished the seminar, it was just beginning of Holy Week when he got back. So he sent everybody pictures of Palm Sunday from his church in Malawi. That's his church in Malawi. And this is Pastor Bahadir Arno, and he's a Turkish Lutheran pastor. And they don't own the church that he's standing in. That's actually an Armenian Catholic church. There are 6 Armenian Catholic churches in Istanbul, but the Armenians only use 2 of them, so they rent out their other churches to other Christian groups because of the laws that prevent them building their own facilities and that, so they rent them out, and that's where they're worshiping. And then this was a dinner that we had at the conference with everybody at the meals, and this is my family. This is my wife, my son, who are here, Patty and Alexander, and these 2 are my daughters. This is my eldest daughter, Cosette. She is studying in California right now, and this is my middle daughter, and she is studying at Concordia, Chicago. She's in a pharmaceutical program there at Concordia. Just to give you, we're actually standing on the Neva River. The shoreline is about where these trees are, and it was end of January, February, and the ice was thick enough to walk out. So I'm born and raised in California, and the idea of being able to walk out on that ice was like, I'm going to do it. And my wife was all excited about doing it. So we actually walked across the neighborhood. It was that frozen. So if you follow us, we have some material too you can take. You can follow us. We have a Facebook, we have an Instagram. That's about as far on social media I'm going to post on. There's some websites, and my email is there. That's available. There is a sign-up sheet, a yellow sheet there, and if you'd like to get our newsletter, you can just give us your name and your email address, and we'll add you to the newsletter. And how can you help us? Well, one of the things I point out is pray. Pray for boldness. Pray that those students around the world will be able to study and boldly proclaim what they believe. Pray that God's word will spread. And pray for protection. More Christians are in dire threat than have been for centuries. And especially those students who are in lands that are not favorable towards Christian or Christ. And effective ministry. It doesn't do any good if you're not effective.
You guys are doing a lot better than we're doing here.
Yeah, well, you'd be surprised. We may have issues, but I could tell you from experience there are people around the world who would just love to have just our issues. And you can support us. Through the LCMS or through Mission Central. What support he has, and will be greatly appreciated. Because without you, there's no way that this could be done. And I'm sure there's questions, because Russia is one of the big news things going on. So, is there any questions?
How's the food over there?
It's
better we eat here.
It's Northern Europe. It's not just Russia. It's just Northern Europe in general. They just don't eat spice.
Was it mostly farming over there? How do they make their money? I mean,
The Russians are
no, where you live there, I mean, how do people, what they do for a living?
most of it in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is the fourth largest city in Europe. There is a Kia plant right outside the city. So they have a car manufacturing. They're putting together Kias. In fact, my son at the school he went to had a lot of Koreans whose parents were there working for that plant. They do farming. A lot of the country has various forms of farming. Gas, fuel, gas. Gazprom is probably the largest employer in Russia. They have a huge surplus of fuel, and they have a certain amount of manufacturing that they do. Is it to the level of other countries? Probably not, but it's there. But most of the young kids are moving to the city, just like they do here. They're leaving the farms and they're going to the city. So there's a lot of growth around St. Petersburg. There's a lot of growth around Moscow. Moscow is the second largest city in Europe. It's massive. I don't know how to describe it, but it's just it sits in this kind of open plain along the Moscow River, and it's just it takes you 2-3 hours to take the circular road around the city. So, Pastor Ken?
Maybe you've covered some of this already, and so I apologize. What's it like being Christian in a formerly, communist atheist country? We talk about how it's getting harder to be a Christian in America, and how does that compare to your setting, your neighbors, your businesses that you interact with? Or
in the States, the average attendance, is about, 17% of Americans attend worship on a regular basis, and it's about 20% in Russia. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of young people who go, and I used to hear a lot. They would talk about, we would know what it's like not to have community, not to have worship, not to have that freedom. So they're not adverse to it, but like any modern European country, they're influenced by a lot of secularism, just like, not to the extent that Western Europe is, and the States actually is much better than Western Europe. So they still have those issues. You still have it always cracked me up. Selfies were everywhere. You see these girls would go out to some picturesque site and they'd be taking photos for their Instagram page, just like they do here, just like they do in Europe. And it goes on. Yes, they have those social ills, because I think that's human nature, those social ills. But there's still much more. I think they're more open or accepting Christianity in particular. Orthodoxy, like I said, is the big church, and most Russians will say they will say they are Orthodox because there's this kind of cultural identity. If you're Russian, you must be Orthodox. So, not that they attend, but they'll have respect for it. It wasn't uncommon. We actually lived near a convent, a Russian Orthodox convent that had been restored, and there was a main street that we would take, and as soon as you saw the convent up the street, a lot of Russians would stop, face the convent, and cross themselves, or maybe kneel in the street to venerate the convent being there, and then they go about their business. And that wasn't uncommon to see that in a lot of places.
How's the crime rate? Is there drug dealers over there too?
It's a different crime. Violent crime is never a big issue with us, but they still have, crime issues. They're very strict on drugs. You don't want to be caught with drugs in Russia. The penalty is pretty rough.
Yeah.
You're going to go to what they call the exile prison. So you'll end up in a kind of a prison that's not a nice place. there was one of the things that the Ingrians do in particular is they have in different areas in the city of Novosibirsk in Siberia. They actually have a halfway house for prisoners. And then we were in another city outside of Moscow. We spent the night at a farm in a town called Tula, and that was a halfway place for people who had issues with drugs or alcohol. Alcohol is a bigger issue than drugs, and this halfway house was for people who had nowhere else to go. And we had spent a couple nights at this place, and that it was run by the Ingrian Church. And they ran it because when you're released from prison, you have very strict rules you have to meet, or you go back to prison. And that is to establish yourself, get a job, and a lot of times families will cut these people off. If you're a prisoner or a drug addict or alcohol, you deal with alcoholism, you'll get cut off. So you have no support, no family support. So they provided these homes, and that I remember the first night we were there, and this older gentleman, I'd say he was in his late 70s, made dinner for us, and he served me dinner, and I remember he had short sleeves on, and all down his arms he had prison tats. You know, if you've ever seen that stereotypical Russian prison tattoo, so that was all down his arms, and that's where we found out where we were. And they explained to us what was going on. It was a working farm, and they could spend their whole life there. It was a place for them to call home. And they worked in a community. It had actually been an old collective farm. And so they had this farmhouse that was 4 stories high with dormitory rooms through it that they had restored. And that's what they were using for this halfway house. So yeah, it's yes, they have issues with drugs, but not to the level that you see in a lot of Western nations. Alcohol was a bigger issue because they have a very loose attitude towards alcohol. Well, to give you an idea, beer was not considered an alcohol until about 5 years ago, and so it wasn't uncommon in the old days for kids to be drinking beer because it wasn't considered alcohol.
What about homelessness?
Oh, they do have it there, and I'm not going to say they don't, but like there are churches that provide places. Ingrians they're halfway houses and dealing with that. Patty and I were walking down the street going, I don't remember where, but we're going down one of the streets. And it was about midday, and it was cold. I mean, it was late fall. Snow hadn't really come in, and these 2 guys had been drinking in the middle of the day and were literally passed out over a cover, and there was an apartment block there, and there was like a cover that would take you down into the basement, and they were passed out on this. And I remember this lady came out with this bucket of water and dumped it on them, and then started screaming at them that they needed to be moving on. They don't tolerate that type of behavior. So yes, there's homelessness, but it's fine.
Not like we're seeing.
Not what you're seeing here. They just don't tolerate it. Well, one of the things that was really hard to get used to is there are panhandlers, and what you'll see are people who are disabled. And what I mean by disabled, I remember sitting on the Metro car, and this guy crawling on his knees because his legs were gone below his knees, and he had his pads on his legs, and he was crawling through the Metro panhandle, begging for money. And I remember going and asking the question, because I always ask questions, so cultural stuff. I'd ask cultural questions, and then I remember I was on my way to a lecture and asked about this because I'd seen it a couple times. And after a while, after living there a year or so, it was the same familiar faces that you started to see it, and they would tell me, "Don't give to them," because the government would take care of it. They could get legs. They could, they needed. With this one gentleman, they could get, wheelchairs and that. But there was a guild, I guess, it's a beggars guild, it was a scam as far as the Russians were concerned. We saw another time a lady had put money in a cup, and they had, and someone turned around and the conversation was a bit tense of not supporting that type of behavior because it's considered bad behavior. But on the other hand, you see these itinerant pilgrims, and they wear black robes. They'll have a backpack, and they'll literally walk from shrine to shrine to shrine, living off of the handouts from the monasteries or from us. And you know who they are. You can't miss them. They're always wearing black robes with long beards. They look like Rasputin. And you see them all around the countryside going from shrine to shrine to shrine. They're different than the panhandlers. As generally, they're not out with their hands like this. And sometimes when you go by the main churches, though, you'll see older ladies literally bowed down to the ground with a cup in front of them, just repeating in Russian, "May God have mercy on you. May God, bless you this day," and so forth. Again, it goes on, but it's not encouraged behavior.
How about police department? Police departments over there, they have like I see on TV time, they just
Politia, all over. Politia. You see them, they wear black uniforms. It's a federal police force.
they're not working for the Russian government, are they?
No, they're a federal police force.
Okay.
They're a federal police force, and there's different levels. FSB, it's really good. The FSB, I think of them more like INS type work interior-wise. But you have a police force that works just like a city.
They get respect over there probably too, don't they?
Yeah, usually it's about 5,000 rubles to be considered respectful.
You get crooked over there too?
But it's, let me just say, it's not just there, it's a lot of places in Europe you have issues with that, folks. So, but yeah, but a lot of times, some of those guys, they're like, it's a hard job. Anyone in law enforcement, not that I'm saying justifying it, but they have that issue. We were in the middle, had been like literally the middle of nowhere, and there was a young policeman in the middle of this road. I don't even think we were 15 miles from a village, and he's out there stopping traffic, warning people about that there was a pig plague going through. The swine black death, and not to buy pork products in this region because of this plague going through in there. But he was in the middle of nowhere, and he had his hat. It's always the joke with police stopping cars. They have a hat, and they always have this extended flashlight. There's a long white end on it, and they'll see you, and they go like this, and they're standing in the middle of the street. You just go through.
Going back to Riga?
We go back to Riga in August. We're doing the visa paperwork. I will still be working with the Russians, albeit online right now. We just got word last week though that things are opening up and some groups are going back. If we go back, it will probably be for intensive programs and so forth, week 2, until things stabilize. But I don't think the Russians keep telling me, "Oh, this fall it should be okay," but it's just Russians.
How are you protected over besides the Lord looking over you? You're not a carry a gun, I guess not, huh?
No, well, violent crime's not an issue.
Oh, it's not.
No, it's not an issue. Petty crime is. My first month there, someone picked my phone out of my pocket in front of the Our Lady of Kazan Cathedral. I was getting on the bus and I put it on a side pocket, not thinking, on a coat, and I wasn't even on the bus 5 minutes when I realized that weight of my phone wasn't in the pocket. Someone just literally brushed by me, saw me put it in my pocket, brushed by, and that was it.
Professional.
Yeah. Yes.
The young lady that you're speaking of, whose grandmother was probably baptized her, what did you say to her?
Well, what you have to do, you have to err on the side of grace. So I'm not going to, later on, if she chose, to become a part of the church, then more than likely, the policy would be they would baptize her. unless you could say, yes, I know I was baptized. So, yeah, and it's not an uncommon statement. A lot of people have been baptized during the silver period at home by grandparents. But like I said, if the grandparents died before they, or the grandmother, usually it was the grandmother. It's not uncommon. They don't necessarily have daycare like we do in the States. Usually it's grandparents who take care of their grandchildren while the parents work during the week. We used to travel all the time and see grandparents taking care of their kids, going shopping with their grandparents. So they do a lot of that. And it's probably why a lot of those grandmothers baptize their kids, because they spend a lot of time with their grandparents. So,
Did you travel a lot while you were there?
as much as I could that COVID would allow. We did go through a period where we were locked down. Then there was limited travel, but I went through the Volga Valley at least twice. I went into Siberia, and there I went up through Karelia. I went on a trip with my son to a father-child camping fishing trip. We were 3 hours from the Arctic Circle at that point.
20 kilometers from the Finnish border.
Yeah, 20 kilometers from the Finnish border, and we were that far north. To give you an idea, we were further north than Montreal and Quebec. So we were pretty well. St. Petersburg is actually at the same latitude as Anchorage.
And all this traveling, is there gas stations nearby?
Oh yeah, Russia is not primitive. The grocery stores look like Walmart. There's a chain called Lenta. There was Lenta. There was a Finnish chain there called Prisma. They have these Lenta had these what they would call hypermarkets, and it looks like a Walmart. And they're all over the cities. Even when we were in Krasnoyarsk in the Far East, they had a Lenta. They had it. And there's another store chain called OK, and they had same thing, big mega store. And we were in the Far East. Auchan's, yeah, Auchan. That was a French grocery store chain. They had up until March. They had IKEA also. There were 2 IKEAs in St. Petersburg. That's how we got most of our silverware and dishes when we went to IKEA.
There are prices too, compare what we do with my map.
Oh yeah, it's IKEA standard pricing. You'd be surprised how much standard pricing is around the world. You go buy electronics. If you buy it in Russia, you buy it in England, it's going to be the same basic price. The only difference will be tax. What you pay in tax. So there were gas stations. Circle K is in Russia. So we used to stop at Circle K, and what's the other one? Lukoil. Yeah, a chain called Lukoil.
They got McDonald's there too, right?
Oh yeah, well they did until March. McDonald's just sold all their franchises to a firm that's going to run them like a McDonald's, but they'll have a different name on them. Burger King is still there. KFC was there. Moscow had a Krispy Kreme. There was a Krispy Kreme donuts in Moscow. I have to tell you, Moscow it's an incredible city. I really like Moscow. It's huge, but we went through the metro system. We went to Lenin's too. He's a short guy. He's only 5'7". But you go in, it's all dark, and he's in a lighted glass case laid out. There's an app service you can use called Find a Guide, and it's like Airbnb, but for tour guides. So you make an arrangement through the app, and we met our guide there by Red Square. And I should tell you, red in Russia has nothing to do with communism. Red in Russia is the word for Russia is krasny, and it's also the same word for beautiful. So if they say something is red, the red square, what they're saying is it's the beautiful square. It has nothing to do with communism. And a lot of Russian houses will have what they call the red corner. And what the red corner is, it's the icon corner. So it's the beautiful corner in the house. They will say that a girl is red. Um, she's beautiful. So that's what it means. So anyway, so we met our guide, and he took us on a tour through Lenin and showed us the Wall of Heroes on the Kremlin Wall and other things from the Soviet era and that. It was an interesting tour. We had a
How
long
about
conversation.
casinos and how about bars over there?
Oh yeah. It's funny. The one thing that cracked me up is the legacy of Irish pubs in Russia. There are a lot of pubs that will be named the Irish pub. It actually goes back to the Soviet days because they would bring in IRA people who were running from the British who were part of the IRA, and they would get refuge in Russia, and they would run these pubs to finance the IRA in Northern Ireland. But they're still there. There's still Irish pubs. There's still Irish pubs, British pubs. It's a cosmopolitan world. Restaurants, there's traditional Russian food that they call this, and you could go to what they call a stolovaya, which goes back to the old Soviet. It's a buffet style serving. It was real common in the factories, and they would do it in the cities, and it would serve typical Russian food. But there were Georgian restaurants. I really liked Armenian restaurants and Georgian restaurants. They do a type of kebab, doner kebab, like a Turkish kebab called a shawarma or shawarma, depending. It's funny, there are certain words they use. In St. Petersburg, they call it shawarma. In Moscow, they call it shawarma. So, shawarma. And as soon as you say what the version is, they know where you're from. And so, and they're usually come. We had one, a Kazakh restaurant. It was a walk-up counter. It cost us to get a kebab like that, a shawarma, and it was usually chicken and just like a kebab. There were French fries and sauce and everything inside of it, and it cost us what, $1.50? Is the exchange like it?
For in the box, it's kind of like a flatbread. It was like 140 rubles.
Yeah, $1.50, $2 at most. It was big. So and the people who ran they were Kazakhs. They were from Kazakhstan. A lot of Kazakhs, a lot of Uzbeks. I had a taxi driver. We had a Uber, it was like an Uber app. There was a company called Get, and they had their own app. And I had purchased some boards, 8-foot boards, and the Metro frowns on you taking 8-foot boards through the train. So I hired I used the app, and I got a van to come pick up my son and I, pick us up and take us home for the boards. And the driver spoke English, and he was curious where he was and where we were from. And then I asked him where he was from, and he says, I'm from Kazakhstan. And I'm looking at him, and I'm going, and I've been around long enough to know Kazakhs. And I look at him, and he must have seen my face, and he goes, I'm of Korean descent. And then he told me that the history of his family had been deported from the Far East. That area of Russia above North Korea has very large Korean populations. And Stalin was afraid that if the Japanese went to war with Russia in the 30s, that the Koreans would side with the Japanese. So he deported them to Kazakhstan. So it wasn't just going from west to east. He would take people from the east into Siberia, because Siberia was a place for people to get lost, to be forgotten. So his family had been sent to Kazakhstan, and he was telling me his mom and brother had moved to the Korean communities in LA. So yes.
I know our time is maybe ticking out here, and I'm having a ball listening to this. Growing up, a missionary went to Africa and lived in dirt and had a thatched roof or something like that. And so it's really interesting to hear about, spreading the gospel and even, to Russia. My question, I know I asked all the faith questions here. My question is, if the Ingrian Lutherans could come to a Lutheran church in America, what message would they want us to hear from them, good or or bad?
Well, I think their stress would be, they're very confessional, and keep it, because that's what kept them alive. I remember we were at English Club, and the Soviets had destroyed so much of Russian culture, or the culture of the communities. And I remember we were talking about holidays in Russia, and in particular Christmas, the Christmas season. The biggest holiday in Russia is actually New Year's. And New Year's is this kind of, think of a Western Christmas with Santa Claus coming on New Year's Day. And it's a little bit different because he has his niece, his granddaughter comes with him, the snow queen, this princess. His name is Ded Moroz, and he's really the Frost King, and he has his niece with him. But so we have Christmas gifts arriving with a yolka, a Christmas tree in the house. And New Year's Eve is like this combination of 4th of July, New Year's Eve, family dinner, drunken midnight bash, trick-or-treating, the kids dress up in costumes and go around looking for candy. So it's this whole kind of, it's a huge holiday for them on the celebration. And I remember asking about it, because what was really strange is you could buy for New Year's cups for with the Chinese zodiac on the cup, celebrating the Chinese zodiac. And I said, well, is that always? And there's a lot of Asian things that are in Russia. You don't wear your shoes in the house. You take your shoes off, just like they do in Asia, the Far East. And they're really, they will yell at you. You walk in too far with your shoes on. And most of the shoes have zippers on them. Boots, they were boots, and all my boots now that I own have zippers on the side, so I can get them on and off easier. But I remember doing this at the English Club, and they made a comment to the effect of a lot of things they do today is they're trying to figure out what they do for holidays. And so some merchandiser had started selling Chinese zodiac. This is the year of the tiger, so there was all these tiger cups, tiger stokons, and they had said that that's why that stuff was done. When I went out to the seminary and I was dealing with the students there, they all made the comment that they didn't lose their traditions, because when they were in the Far East, the liturgy, the practice of the liturgy in a small group and Bible study is what kept them together. It was not anything fancy. It was not anything elaborate, and that's what they find sometimes. Not just American churches in general. They find them shallow. They see a shallowness in America, but it's this. So these things, these traditions and practices, is what kept them going during that time frame. So what they would say is, hold to the truth, keep to the truth, keep the message, and you don't need this kind of shallow attitude towards stuff. An average, to give you an ideal too, a pastor, when he's called to the congregation, sees that call as a lifetime call. The average call, I think, in the Missouri Synod, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's 5 years, 5 to 6 years now. It used to be 7 to 8, but now it's 5 to 6 years. Pastors are moving, and they're shocked when we've had those conversations. Because in their mind they get the call, and it's a lifetime call. Now, a lot of times the guys are coming. What they'll do is they'll restore a community, a church community, and they'll look for somebody in the community to come in and to come to seminary, to go back to that community to serve, to maintain it. Yeah, they're restoring. A lot of it is restoring where there had been churches. But they'll call a pastor, literally call someone out of that church to study, to go back to that church.
This cathedral, you see the gold. What is that symbol?
It's just
fancy.
just fancy. It's not
Like color red is beautiful.
Yeah, it's just decorative. It stands out. Moscow was known for the gold domes, and it's not gold. It's a type of
Looks like
brass. It's a type of brass that they use that doesn't corrode. It looks really nice. It's impressive. It's impressive when you
What's
see
the
it.
oldest church over you said before in the beginning? The old?
The oldest Lutheran church in St. Petersburg is St. Anne's, but there are old Orthodox churches west of Moscow. Moscow's considered the new city, even though it's 1,000 years old. There are cities, Vladimir. You'll hear cities like Vladimir and Yaroslav. They call it the Golden Ring, and these are churches. These are cities that go back at least 1,500 years, and they're all. This area is kind of northeast of Moscow. Moscow's the new city.
We have no concept of that here yet.
No, but I will tell you that we have cities on the East Coast that are older than St. Petersburg. In fact, older than a lot of the new cities. There are old countries, but some of the cities that we think of being old are not as old even as some of our colonial cities. St. Petersburg is one of them. It doesn't get started until 1720. And how old is Boston and Charleston? Yeah, because he doesn't fight the war until the early 1700s with the Swedes. And the city doesn't really get started in 1720. And it's a wooden city. The city you see today actually gets built in the 19th century. I'm kind of an architect geek, so it has two architectural designs. The 19th century is Art Nouveau, and there's still a lot of Art Nouveau buildings through the city. And then Riga actually is the number one, has the 800 Art Nouveau cities in the city of Riga. And they go back over 1,000 years. Our apartment, if you look on the left, that's a picture of our apartment on the board. And our apartment goes back 500 years.
Was it roof leak?
No, we've got two apartments above us. So, but we've got 2 foot thick wood beams for our roof. Yeah. So, okay. I think that's about it. Oh, yes.
How long do you plan on, or will you be a missionary over there?
Until they get tired of me. So that's what I'm hoping.
It's one more than 5 years.
More than 5 years, yeah. Until they get tired of me, and we'll see what's going on. As long as I'm useful, I guess is the way.
As long as you stay healthy too.
Yeah, I try to do that. Yes, I do. I can do basic questions, and I can, they talk to me. I can do more than go be known. So, and it was funny in Riga, about a little more than a third of the population is Russian speaking. So I actually find myself using Russian any more than I've ever used Latvian. It's funny, a lot of the Latvians speak English, and they actually told me don't bother learning the language because no one learns it. They know the Latvians learn English anyhow. So.
Well, English is the second largest spoken language in the world.
Oh yeah. So I can do the basics. So Latvia, which is good afternoon. Politis, thank you. The basic courtesies I've learned since I've been there. But it's been funny. Because of you get into a habit when you're in a foreign country using things that you know, and so I found myself sometimes in the store being asked, "Do I want a bag?" and нет спасибо, and they'll all of a sudden switch to Russian. So a lot of them still, a lot of the old people still. Okay, I'm getting the watch thing.
I'm not going to shake a fist at you. I really do thank you for coming, and Patty and Alex, right? Alec, for coming as well, and it's been a pleasure to hear from you. We want to pray for you, and so I'll start with ladies first. But you're on YouTube, so if it's very personal, but is there some way that we could continue to keep you guys in prayer?
Yeah, some prayer is just so that we're able to serve, that we have the support we need.
Okay.
It's been
Keep us from
You're going insane. That we have that same prayer here.
Well, just that you know, a certain amount of peace will stay there. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's tense because of the geopolitics, and even in Russia, I've talked to them, and they've already told me they've been doing funerals of conscripts being killed.
Oh.
Part of the community in Kultusha is a church there, and they've already, and one of the churches in the Far East in Ulan-Ude is already, so they're already experiencing. Their policy has been to pray for peace. They're taking a middle road because of the politics. But yeah, they're it's not good for them, and it's not good for the rest of Europe. It's just war has always been ugly, and it always is.
Yeah.
So, but there's a certain amount of peace that can be restored.
Absolutely. Any last comments? Let's close in prayer and pray for the Lawsons. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time where you've given us the ability to hear of the Lutheran missions in Russia and in Latvia. We pray for the Lawsons, that you would bless their time in either place, wherever the Lord sends them. Bless them with an ability to share their faith in Jesus Christ, wherever they are. Bless them with peace and safety. Keep them from losing their minds. And we pray, Lord, that you would bless them with friends and Christian friends in every place that they go. We pray for all missionaries in every country, that you would bless the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus. And dear Lord, we pray for all nations. We pray for Russia and for Latvia, for Finland, for the Ukraine, for the United States, and for all of our leaders, that you would bless us with peace, with wisdom, and with a common love for our fellow man. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And if you want to talk to him, you got to beat him out the door. So, no, I'm sure he's still able to answer a few questions or have a good discussion.
And there are church building here, and then something down.
Okay.